Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us all here, and thank you, Toussaint, for that introduction. Um, that's a great place to start because I think that we're getting better at understanding that the system we have today is strange and weird and historically unprecedented, but it goes to the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight, I think, how unusual this moment is. And it's not unusual in terms of its racial disproportionality. It's not unusual in terms of the abuses that go on behind bars and the terrible working conditions in prisons. It's unusual, though, in its sheer size and its sheer scope. We have not had this many people locked up ever in American history, and no country has ever had this many people locked up. And so there's lots of reasons why we got here, but I want to just say that the reason we got here was not crime. And that tends to be the real eye-opener, I think, for a lot of people. We tend to think about this as something that begins when it does because crime was out of control. And for those of us that study this intimately, we can assure you that whereas crime has gone up and down throughout American history, the responses to it have been very specific to the moment. And in this moment, which was 1965, we really began a whole new approach to dealing with social ills. It was on the heels of rebellions in Rochester and Philly and across the urban north that very quickly we began to criminalize space in new ways. And the upshot of the story is within 4 decades, we had mass incarceration, and it was more racially disproportionate than it had ever been, larger than it had ever been, and more profitable, frankly, than it had ever been. But we chose it. It was a policy choice, not a crime imperative. Crime will start to rise, but many have argued that, in fact, mass incarceration creates more violence rather than solves it.
And I think we're missing to some degree Elizabeth's voice on this because I think her work on the crime bill of 1965 and really the way in which the war on crime under the Johnson administration, you know, came sort of hand in hand with some of the work that the Johnson administration also did in terms of the war on poverty, and really helped set the stage from going from a moment where we had about 200,000 people in prison all across this country during the 1960s and early 1970s to our current moment where we have 2.3 million people behind bars. Really, that scale of our prison population sort of is kind of what really typifies mass incarceration. At least during that, the growth of the prison system and really the emergence of mass incarceration, Heather, what was happening in prisons across the nation prior to Attica, prior to that uprising, and how did the national scene influence, if at all, the different parties involved at Attica, the prisoners, the COs, the Governor Rockefeller, the media, kind of what was happening at the moment that some of the images that are behind us and really kind of give us our best understanding of what was taking place in Attica, what was taking place at that moment.
Well, one of the interesting things is even though the war on crime really begins in 1965, the prison rate was actually still pretty steady for quite some time. It doesn't really peak or start to go up, I should say, until after Attica. And that is in part because there was a tremendous amount of civil rights activism going on in prisons at that time. And if you would have polled most Americans in 1970, I've actually looked at these polls, most Americans actually believed that the death penalty should not happen, that prisoners deserve basic human rights, and that we should move towards fewer prisons, in other words, decarceration. And it was in this moment of sort of optimism and activism that at Attica, you had prisoners and guards alike recognizing that this institution was barbaric, prisoners being fed on 63 cents a day, medical care being horrific, guards working way too many hours without enough assistance, and it was a powder keg in essence, but it was one that was going to turn not just into a chaotic riot, but actually a really important rebellion because the people inside had been really discussing the issues on the inside as actively as, for example, civil rights activists were discussing them on the outside. So it wasn't just rampant complaining, it was a real articulation of, we can do this thing differently, we need to do it differently, and we're going to demand that we do it differently.